For nearly a quarter century, the rebel Netherlands battled with their lord Felipe II, the King of Spain and Portugal. What had started as a rebellion against their lord's unconstitutional measures was turning into a war for independence. But Felipe had shifted his focus to France, who had just lost King Henri III. He became obsessed with keeping its lawful king, the Protestant Henri de Bourbon, from the French throne. He wanted the crown for himself, or else his eldest daughter, the Infanta Isabella Clara Eugenia. The king redirected a lot of his troops stationed in the Low Countries to invade France. Felipe's governor-general for the Netherlands, his nephew, the Italian Alessandro Farnese, the Duke of Parma, was frustrated with the king's impractical orders. He needed these troops to defend the Spanish-held Netherlands and return the whole country, all 17 states, to the king. The rebel stadholders Count Moritz von Nassau and his cousin Count Wilhelm Ludwig von Nassau had been taking many cities, using all sorts of newfangled ideas about warfare. However, for Felipe, France turning Protestant was a much bigger problem than the Dutch rebel republic growing slightly. The Duke of Parma was not a happy camper. He said he'd rather abandon his office and retire into the woods to feed on roots than to have to deal with the constant lack of money, men and means to do the great things that King Felipe ordered him to do. Against his better judgment, Parma left the Netherlands again with 16,000 men to break King Henri's siege of the most important city in Normandy, Rouen. Parma's army arrived in the area in February 1592 and joined Charles de Lorraine, the Duke of Mayenne, and other French nobles from the League. Henri split his troops. He left one part at Rouen to continue the siege and took most of the cavalry to stop the Duke. He was joined by Count Philip von Nassau, Willem Lodewig's younger brother, who commanded a rebel force of 2,000 men. Though both fought bravely, they were not very successful. Meanwhile, the garrison commander of Rouen, André Baptiste Brancas, Seigneur de Villars, told Parma that relief was no longer necessary. His sorties against the king's men had been effective, and he only needed some reinforcements and ammo. Parma was like, doubt. But he sent 800 horse into the city and then laid siege on Rue, the only fortified town in the north of France still in Henri's hands. A month later, Parma received an urgent message from Villars. Rouen was running low on supplies. The Dutch rebel army and navy had thrown up a super effective blockade. If Rouen wasn't relieved by April 20th, it would fall in Henri's hands. Parma marched back to the city immediately. Henri raised the siege on April 20th, the day Rouen was supposed to fall. Parma then besieged Caudebec. But the Duke was very ill. He had heart problems, water on the chest, and terrible gout in the limbs. However, he feared that if he laid down in bed, he would just die. While out supervising the siege works, people noticed Parma suddenly went very pale. He hadn't told anyone, but he had been shot between the wrist and the elbow and was steadily bleeding out. It was a bad wound for an already ill man. He ran a high fever, and gangrene set in. Fortunately, Caudebec fell quickly. Parma had completed his mission and wanted to return to the Netherlands, but the Spanish were trapped on a peninsula. King Henri's troops blocked the Duke's route on land, and Dutch rebel ships prevented him from escaping down the river Seine. Parma had to either attack Henri head-on, surrender, starve, or somehow cross the broad, deep, and wild river. Henri thought he had him. Parma would never dare cross the Seine. Of course, Parma crossed the Seine. He secretly built 2 forts to cover his army as it crossed the river in ships. When Henri smelled a rat and raced to the Seine, he was too late. The Spanish had landed safely on the other side and burned the vessels before his eyes. Darn. Outgeneraled again. The Holy Roman Emperor Rudolf II of the Habsburg Empire was dealing with attacks from the Ottoman Empire and could really use the Spanish troops to help him, and Count Mauritz's highly trained modern army would also come in handy. So, to free up these armies, he decided to negotiate a peace with the rebel Netherlands on behalf of the King of Spain. King Felipe saw no harm in the Emperor and the rebel states just talking, but the rebels had to convert to the Roman Catholic religion, resubmit to Felipe, and pay for all the king's war expenses. He was willing to drop the third demand. Felipe hoped the talks would be endless and give him a much-needed truce. Then all his troops would become available to invade France, while also stopping Maurits in his tracks. But the States General shut the Holy Roman Emperor down real quick. They knew this was one of Felipe's tricks. Meanwhile, the rebel states didn't mind Parma being gone one bit. Count Maurits planned a campaign in the north to please the Frisians, but the Zeelanders demanded that their stadholder take Geertruidenberg. It took Attorney General Johan of Oldenbarneveld weeks of negotiating to get everyone to sign off on the northern campaign. Maurits then joined his cousin, stadholder Willem Lodewijk, in his neck of the woods. First up was Steenwijk in Overijssel. Capturing that town would make Friesland easier to defend and get rid of the pirates who'd been attacking Amsterdam merchants. King Felipe's stadholder for Friesland, Groningen, Drenthe en Overijssel, Francisco Berdugo, breathed a sigh of relief that Count Maurits had picked Steenwijk and not cities like Oldenzaal or Grol. Those cities were guaranteed to fall, but not Steenwijk. That place would hold. The town had strong fortifications, and the counts only had 6,000 foot and 2,000 horse between them. Parma's military governor, Antoine de Coqueuil, with his 2,000 foot and some cavalry, was joined by 19-year-old Lodewijk van den Berg and his 1,200 Walloon infantrymen. Lodewijk was yet another one of Maurits and Willem Lodewijk's cousins, a son of Willem van den Berg and Willem of Orange's sister Maria. The rebels spent a week digging earthworks in the pouring rain to bring 45 cannons into position. On June 13, 1592, Count Maurits started firing, but 6 days and 7,000 cannonballs later, he had barely made a dent in the walls. All he had done was convert 100,000 florins into noise and smoke. The Count was in a foul mood, swearing and cursing and kicking over a chessboard when he lost a game. Did I mention that Maurits was a sore loser? Finally, Willem Lodewijk managed to persuade his cousin to change tactics. They were going to place bombs beneath the city gates. For the next 10 days, the miners dug 4 tunnels toward the city walls. Then they dug 2 large chambers right beneath the city's gates, the Oosterpoort and the Gasthuispoort. The chambers were packed with 5,000 and 2,500 pounds of gunpowder respectively. The first massive bomb neatly brought down the Oosterpoort, but the Gasthuispoort bomb caused the wall to collapse outward, not inward. It crushed the rebel soldiers standing by for the attack. Nearly 100 men got trapped, 8 lost their lives and many more were injured. Maurits hesitated whether to give the signal to storm the breaches, but Willem Lodewijk took charge. "The town is freaking out, man, let's go!" He and his men quickly occupied both gates. Though the explosions had scared the living daylights out of the Spanish, they recovered quickly and started firing at their besiegers. English commander Sir Francis Vere was shot in the leg, his brother Robert was hit in the arm, and Count Maurits was struck in the face by a ricocheting bullet. He pulled the slug out of his left cheek himself. It wasn't a bad wound, but a very close call, and the stadholder had a speech impediment for quite a while after this. Just as Willem Lodewijk was ready to storm the place, the besieged sent out a trumpeter to negotiate a surrender. Maurits, whose wound had just been dressed, believed he could hold out for better terms. He got them the next day. Among the 350 Spanish killed was the youngest Van den Berg brother, Lodewijk. After Steenwijk, it was Coevorden's turn. If that town fell, Berdugo would be surrounded, and he could kiss Groningen goodbye. Except, the Steenwijk siege had been very expensive, and Count Maurits needed more money. This wasn't easy, but after some serious wheeling and dealing, Oldenbarneveld got everyone to pay up, and the counts headed out. The States General wrote in their orders that they very much wanted Maurits to stay out of the fracking firing line. They also ordered the Captain General to split up his force. The smaller section would move on Coevorden, while the stadholder would take the rest of the army south. King Henri had asked for more troops. This was absurd. Coevorden couldn't be taken with so few men. Maurits was livid. He'd been relegated to a mere captain. What was he, a child? The stadholder ordered the entire army to move on Coevorden instead. The States General, Oldenbarneveld, can shove it. On July 28, 1592, Maurits left Willem Lodewijk in charge of digging the trenches and headed out to besiege Oud-Marsum. He needed it to protect his supply lines. The Count fired his usual 3 salvos, and the town surrendered. Meanwhile, Sir Francis Vere and his English troops had taken Doesburg. Maurits raced back to Coevorden, which would be a tough nut to crack. It had a wide moat of 100 feet across, a substantial defensive wall, 5 ramparts, and 2 strategically placed redoubts. This wasn't Coevorden's first rodeo. Berdugo wasn't worried at all. He said, "If Coevorden doesn't hold, there is no place in the world that can hold." On August 16th, Count Maurits sent a trumpeter to the city walls to demand Coevorden's surrender. And on the other side of that wall, another one of the Nassau cousins, Frederik van den Berg. The trumpeter blew 3 times, and Frederick appeared on the battlements, alone. "What say ye? To claim this city in the name of Count Maurits of Nassau and of the States General." Frederick replied, "Tell him to first shoot down the walls until they're as flat as the moat, and then to dare storm us 5 or 6 times. Then I will consider for 6 months about whether or not I want to send a trumpeter." Frederick was convinced Verdugo would come to relieve the city, but Verdugo was convinced Frederick didn't need to be relieved. Excellent communication, guys. Verdugo finally figured out that a relief was necessary to save the northernmost part of the Spanish realm and went south to get some troops. In the meantime, the state soldiers had been shoveling and shoveling and shoveling. Finally, they reached the main ravelin, which Maurits planned to blow up in a matter of days. On September 3rd, 1592, Verdugo approached Coevorden with an army of 4,000 foot and 1,800 horse. He shot fireworks in the air to let the town know their rescuers had arrived. The States General deputies wanted Maurits to sic the German reiters on him, but the stadtholder said no. Maurits hated field battles. A few days later, half an hour before sunrise, Verdugo launched a camisado on the state's larger camp. The Spanish soldiers wore white shirts over their armor to recognize each other in the dark. They killed the sentinels and broke through the defenses, shrieking hellishly and screaming "Victory! Victory!" to confuse those in the camp. Count Willem Lodewijk, who was staying in the smaller camp, was alarmed by the noise. He didn't take the time to put on his armor, got on his horse and raced toward the mayhem. He shouted at the men who were barely awake to get up and fight back. The Count was then shot into his side and out his belly button, but he refused to be treated while the battle was ongoing. He ordered 2 squadrons of horse to leave the camp and threatened the Spanish left flank to create a panic. Then the Count's Frisian companies from the larger camp arrived and the battle got really intense. Then Count Maurits arrived on the scene. He brought a large force and these guys were all armored up. He got everyone in battle array fast using the commands the men had trained for and ordered the destruction of all white shirts. It was easy pickings. The Spanish were now clearly visible in the light of dawn. Verdugo was surprised to be suddenly faced with the highly organized state's troops and retreated. The rebels buried 165 white shirts and many more were wounded. The Captain General had lost 3 men and 6 were wounded. Willem Lodewijk was one of them. The Count's bowels were intact, mostly. He would be fine. Later that day, Count Philip of Nassau returned from France and brought a few fresh companies. Willem Lodewijk's younger brother was brave, but also reckless and a heavy drinker. One night he got so drunk that he got on his horse without armor and decided to inspect the city's fortifications. Then his drunk ass charged at a Spanish battery. The Spanish were like, "Get a load of this guy," and started shooting at Philip. Peter, Lord of Sidolnitsky, the sergeant major from his regiment, and Maurits's master of the horse guards raced to get Philip to safety. The men managed to pull him off his horse before he got injured, but Sidolnitsky was shot in the leg and he almost died. Count Frederik van den Berg had said that he would fight as long as he had fuses and gunpowder, but after Verdugo's defeat, he surrendered Coevorden to his cousins. On September 12, 1592, Maurits agreed that Frederik and his men could leave with full honors of war. Willem Lodewijk smugly waved him farewell, later's cuz. Maurits wanted to send his army home for the winter, but the States General ordered him to march south to the Rhine at the French king's request. Maurits did, but after a month and a half of nothing, he sent the soldiers to winter quarters. The Duke of Parma was still recovering from the infected wound on his arm and had gone to Spa to recuperate. Ever since the Armada debacle, Parma had been in hot water with his boss, King Felipe. His enemies were whispering all sorts of crazy things in Felipe's ears and made the king doubt Parma's loyalty. Was the Italian even really fighting for him anymore? Parma had been on the ground telling Felipe what was what, but the king believed in miracles and didn't like hearing bad news, no matter how truthful. Twice now the Duke had ignored Felipe's orders, all to save 2 cities that he ended up losing anyway. Finally, Felipe was fed up and started plotting to get rid of Parma. He first had to be lured to Spain, so the king wrote the Duke, "Could you come to Madrid to advise us in person, please, pretty please?" Juan Pacheco Osorio y Enriquez Marqués de Cerralbo was sent to the Spanish Netherlands to convince the Governor-General to comply with the king's request. If he refused, the Duke would be taken to Spain by force. Parma was about to be ruined. Cerralbo died on his way over, and the job went to Count Fuentes, a man Parma considered dangerous and cruel. The Duke was aware of the nasty rumors about him, and he wasn't gonna wait around for Fuentes to arrive in Brussels, so he dragged his sick body to France and made camp in Arras. As Parma prepared to go to bed at his usual hour, he fainted and never woke again. Alessandro Farnese, Duca di Parma, Piacenza e Castro, died on the 3rd of December 1592, aged 47. His temporary replacement was Count Peter Ernst von Mansfeld-Vodeoort, but the man really in charge was Pedro Enriquez de Acevedo y Alvarez de Toledo, Conde de Fuentes de Valdepero, aka the dreaded Count Fuentes. The man had already been a candidate for the governor-generalship after Don Luis de Requesens died. Fuentes didn't like Mansfeld, a weak and feeble man who relied on his son Karl too much. He quickly replaced all Parma's men with his own, and not a thing could be done without Fuentes' consent. The nobles of the Spanish Netherlands were not happy with Fuentes. He despised all the non-Spaniards and replaced the locals in their Council of State with Spanish nobles. Not this again. The Spanish Netherlands quickly started negotiating a peace directly with the Republic. They would re-establish the pacification of Ghent, unite once more, and drive out the Spanish together. Not this again. It took a while for them to realize the Spanish were behind this plan all along. Felipe was really trying to get that truce so he could send all his troops to France. Then the king heard that the French had already decided they would never accept a foreign king. Time for Plan B. In the new year, King Henri requested the state's army to go to Luxembourg to take on Mansfeld. The campaign under Count Philip of Nassau was only partially successful. When Mansfeld marched toward Luxembourg with a large army, Henri backed out, and everyone retreated. Well, at least they'd lured the new governor-general away from rebel territory for a while. Meanwhile, in Friesland, Willem Lodewijk was building new forts with fortification designer Adriaan Antoniszoon of Alkmaar. He finished the job despite being constantly harassed by his cousins Herman and Frederik van den Berg. Because the Frisians weren't sending any troops south, Mansfeld figured that Groningen was the rebels' next target. He sent his troops northeast, but Count Maurits was headed southwest to Geertruidenberg. Maurits knew a quick surrender wasn't in the cards. Geertruidenberg was heavily fortified and surrounded by many dikes, keeping the city well protected. Maurits set up camp west of the town, captured the Steelhoven bastion, and ordered Lieutenant General Philip von Hohenlohe to build a fort near Raamsdonk on the east side. The stadholder fortified his army camp on the outside in case a relief army attacked and built a circumvallation line. To complete the circle around Geertruidenberg and prevent the relief by water, he placed ships on the river in a half-moon formation connected by cables. Then Maurits did a new old thing. He also built a contravallation line to protect his troops from attacks from the city. He was gonna besiege Geertruidenberg with as little loss of life as possible. Maurits used sluices and dams to keep the state's army's camps dry and to flood the surrounding areas. Now the Spanish coming to relieve the town couldn't set up any cannons. The state's army also booby-trapped the whole area with bombs and man-traps, camouflaged holes in the ground with swords sticking up from the bottom. Yikes. Maurits had more tricks up his sleeve. For instance, he put a bunch of fake wooden cannons in an empty ship relatively close to the city. Those in Geertruidenberg couldn't tell they weren't real and shot at them. A lot, wasting their limited supply of ammo. In the meantime, 3,000 miners started digging. And if digging was your thing, Geertruidenberg was the place to be. It was the most extensive excavation of the entire war. Over 2,000 people, men, women and children, traveled from all over the country and abroad to see the spectacle like it was some grand carnival. Siege tourism. Count Maurits remained close to the action to ensure the safety of his troops, but also to keep them digging and maintain law and order. He had more authority than any of those under his command. When Maurits left for a few days to attend his half-sister Louisa Juliana's wedding to Kurfürst Friedrich IV, Elector of Pfalz, work definitely slowed down. It returned to full force only when he came back. Maurits then ordered Hohenlohe to build another fort further away from the Raamsdonk fort. Hohenlohe was livid. Building a second fort would put his men in too much danger. While his men started digging, the Count started arguing. Hohenlohe suddenly shouted to his men, "Here, you captains and soldiers, you are delivered up to be butchered. You may drop work and follow me to the old fort." Maurits calmly told the men, "And I swear to you that the first man who moves from this spot shall be hanged." No one moved. The new fort was completed without incident and held. At the end of May, Count Mansfeld arrived with cannon blasts and fireworks. Maurits had 5,000 men. Mansfeld had double that number. But when he moved in to break the siege, he got nowhere fast. Everything was locked up tight. Mansfeld then sent a trumpeter to ask the stadtholder why he wouldn't be tempted to a field battle for honor and glory like any young warrior would. The answer? Because Maurits would like to become an old field marshal. Just like you, Excellency. Everyone laughed. Mansfeld was 76, and Maurits hated field battles. 2 months into the siege, Geertruidenberg's garrison was in a state of confusion. Were they ever gonna be relieved? The city's military governor, de Marieres, and 3 of his men climbed to the top of the tower of the Geertruids church to see what was going on. Hohenlohe shot 1 cannonball at the tower, and all fell to their deaths. On June 24, 1593, 3 very adventurous captains, Haan, Kalf, and Bivry, were relieved of their watch in the trenches. They looked at the ravelin, which was already weakened from the mining underneath, and thought, hey, we should climb up there and have a look. Why they thought they could do this without getting killed on the spot is anyone's guess, but off they went with about 50 men. They threw a bridge of rush mats across the moat, a new invention of Maurits, and carefully climbed the walls. Bivry was a little surprised when he suddenly found himself inside the ravelin. The Spanish sentinels were even more surprised to see the rebels climbing in. They sounded the alarm, and a fierce hand-to-hand combat broke out, killing 16 state soldiers and 9 of the garrison. When rebel commander Count Georg Eberhard von Solms arrived to see what the ruckus was about, city deputies grabbed him and humbly asked him to please accept the terms for surrender. They've been trying to find someone to surrender to for days now. The garrison had to leave weapons and banners behind. They had held out too long and had not been nice to the population. Although, when they left, Maurits showed mercy and returned their weapons to them. The Count also lent them carts to transport the wounded. 4 men of the garrison weren't allowed to leave. They were burg sellers who had sold Geertruidenberg to the Spanish back in '89. They were hanged. It was the first and last victory of 1593. Money had run out. But the rebels were in luck. The Spanish and Italian armies returning to the Netherlands from France to help Mansfeld deal with Maurits wanted their back pay and started a mutiny. So the Spanish were out for the Count as well. But Count Willem Lodewijk was given some money to take a few ramparts in East Groningen, which he did, so the Frisians would shut up. Meanwhile, Berdugo hadn't sat still either. He retook Oud-Marsum and some other places, but he couldn't stand the fact that he had lost Coevorden. So Berdugo besieged it late in the year. Willem Lodewijk had supplied the place well, and the winter was harsh for Berdugo's men. 40 ended up dying every day. King Felipe tried his plan B when he ordered Charles de Lorraine, the son of the late Henri de Lorraine, the Duke of Guise, to marry Isabella. He then demanded that the French elected the couple their king and queen. The French told him to go away, and the wedding was off. After all that money spent on the civil war in France, the King of Spain and Portugal had nothing to show for it. Felipe considered his options when the unthinkable happened. In July 1593, King Henri of Navarre claimed he had seen the light by way of the Holy Spirit and converted to the Roman Catholic faith. The Protestants tried to stop him, but Paris vaut bien une messe. Paris is well worth a mass, he supposedly said. He wanted to end the civil war. The new Pope, Clement VIII, who had just replaced Pope Innocent IX, who had replaced Pope Gregorius XIV, agreed. Dressed in all white, Henri confessed to the Archbishop of Bourges and was absolved. Henri de Bourbon was crowned King Henri IV of France on February 27, 1594. Paris still wouldn't let him in, but Henri bought someone off to open the gates, and at midnight he rode into Paris armed to the teeth with fierce-looking troops. It was enchanting. The rebels and the English now both leaned on Henri to declare war on Spain. The French king told them he would, if they sent him more troops and money. 25-year-old Infanta Isabella had to get married. Felipe eventually found a candidate in his own family, continuing the dubious Habsburg tradition of inbreeding. He initially picked his nephew, the Holy Roman Emperor Rudolf II, but those negotiations dragged on and on. So, Felipe went for the next best thing, the emperor's younger brother, the Archduke Ernst von Österreich. Ernesto de Austria, as Felipe called him, had been raised at the Spanish court. The Archduke was quite eager to take the king up on his offer. Isabella was going to get the Netherlands as a dowry, and that could lead to more. To test him, Felipe sent him over to be the new governor-general for the Low Countries. Physically, Ernst was a weak man, crippled with gout and unfit for battle. But he was received in Brussels like a messiah with a massive feast in January 1594. People expected great things from the new governor-general. Sure, he had been raised in Spain, but people figured he could put the arrogant Spaniards in their place. Ernst did treat the Spanish nobles pretty badly, that is, until Count Fuentes got his claws in him. The Archduke called for kindness and justice. He wanted to reinstate the old pacification of Ghent and unify the Low Countries. To show he was serious about peace, he hadn't brought any soldiers with him. But really, the man had no money and couldn't afford soldiers. The rebel states general didn't believe him for 1 second. If he wanted peace, why was Ernst trying so hard to kill Maurits? King Felipe had put Count Fuentes in charge of the Spanish realm's assassination department. He sent him many ideas on how to get rid of King Henri, Queen Elizabeth, Count Maurits, Oldenbarneveld, and other troublemakers. In early spring 1594, Rénichon, a priest and schoolmaster in Namur, was told over dinner that Archduke Ernst wanted him to kill Maurits. He would get a nice reward. Maurits was known to be a friendly gentleman who always took the time to talk to the people in the streets. The schoolmaster had to buy a good pair of pistols, move to The Hague, start a school, and lurk around until he ran into the stadtholder on the streets. Oh, and if he could kill Oldenbarneveld as well while he was at it? Oh, and he had to stop by Leiden and lure Maurits' younger half-brother, 10-year-old Frederik Hendrik, out of school and kill him. Felipe's kill list was kinda long, but Rénichon was arrested for his lurking behavior, and the entire plot was revealed during his trial. He was convicted and executed. Later in the year, Pierre de Four, a French soldier serving in the state's army, was taken to Ernst's bedchamber. He was told the Archduke lay ill in bed, concealed by curtains. Four had to get hired as the stadtholder's bodyguard. He could shoot Maurits when he went hunting, mounted his horse, left the church, or at some other unguarded moment. A voice, presumably Ernst, said, "Will you do what I ask? Will you kill this tyrant?" When Four was like, "Sure," Ernst replied, "Then, my son, you will go straight to paradise." During a special Roman Catholic ceremony, he was told he would become invisible the moment he took aim at Count Maurits. Four was arrested during his preparations. The holy cloak of invisibility hadn't arrived yet. He was convicted and executed. The Spanish claimed that it hadn't been Ernst in the bed. Four had been duped by an impersonator. Sure. The first military exploits of the States in 1594 were, shall we say, less than stellar. A surprise nighttime attack on 's-Hertogenbosch failed. The soldiers were discovered when one of the men misstepped and kicked a rock in the moat. 600 men sent to surprise Maastricht simply chickened out on their way there. 6 months into Berdugo's siege of Coevorden, the States decided that the country's reputation was at stake. They should relieve the city. In May, Maurits brought a massive military force of 19,000 men together in Zwolle and marched on Coevorden. He left Hohenlohe in the Bommelerwaard to defend Holland and Gelderland. When Berdugo heard of these amassed troops, he boasted that he would have those heretics for breakfast. But when spies told him that the state's army was close, the royal stadtholder lifted the siege and retreated in the middle of the night in total silence, before breakfast. The state's deputies in the field couldn't decide what to do next. Give Berdugo chase and crush him once and for all? Take Rheinberg or head for Groningen? All the states started arguing, but the orders were confirmed in The Hague. They were gonna besiege the city of Groningen and add the state of Groningen as the 7th province to the Republic. Maurits and Willem Lodewijk took their massive force north to get Groningen, the 3rd largest city in the Low Countries, after Antwerp and Amsterdam. To the east and west were marshlands. The land beyond the north side was in rebel hands, so the siege would concentrate on the south side. There lay the fortified suburb Schuitenschuiverschans, housing Lieutenant Colonel Jarig Liaukema and some 900 Spanish soldiers. Groningen also had so many cannons on the city walls. Maurits set up his camps with a circumvallation and a contravallation line, and the miners started digging trenches in a zigzag pattern toward the walls of Groningen. When Maurits was in one of those ditches, a bullet fired from the town hit his shield with such force that he fell down. Horace Vere, Francis's brother, who had just joined the state's army, was right behind him. He was also knocked to the ground. Another close call. Johan Pauli, one of the state's deputies in the field, once again reprimanded Maurits, "Stay out of the fracking firing line." Maurits was like, "Why don't you people get it? I need to stand shoulder to shoulder with the guys in the trenches to support and motivate them." The Spanish ramparts were quickly cleared. 2 forts were captured, with a little violence and a lot of violence respectively. Groningen was completely isolated, but the citizens held out hope for relief. The city magistrates gave Maurits evasive answers every time he demanded their surrender to stall for time. Like many towns at this time, Groningen was hopelessly divided. No one could agree what reply to send. The Spanish-minded in the city squared off against the States-minded, the Roman Catholics, not necessarily pro-Spanish, against the Protestants, not necessarily pro-States, the rich, who wanted to join the thriving republic, against the poor, who were dedicated to their Roman Catholic faith. They simply couldn't get a majority for any decision. Plus, they were a well-fortified and well-supplied city with enough food and ammo. So they waited for relief from either the new Governor-General Ernst or Verdugo. But their letters promising relief turned out to be fakes written from inside the city itself. After the endless shooting back and forth and the countless dead and injured, with numerous buildings destroyed in the city, Maurits' third letter ordering the surrender arrived. The city council, pressured by a group of women who violently argued with them to end the siege, finally decided to start negotiating. The town got restless. 15 Jesuit priests warned the lower classes that hell and damnation would rain down on them if they surrendered the city. They panicked and stormed the council meeting and held the councilors hostage. Now rebel citizens took up arms and scared them away again. The Roman Catholics then brought the soldiers from the Schuitenschuiverschans in to scare the Protestants. The garrison got in battle array. The armed citizens did the same. It was a standoff, and everyone feared a massacre. But then, real letters from Ernst and Verdugo arrived. Count Fuentes was underway. The city magistrates quickly withdrew from the negotiations, and the siege continued for another month. At night, glowing cannonballs lit up the sky over Groningen to keep those in the city wide awake and scared. People, including children, were killed on the market square or while sleeping in their beds. A woman even found a cannonball next to her baby in the cradle. On July 15, 1594, at 10 o'clock at night, the mine beneath the Oosterpoort was detonated. The place blew up, taking 40 garrison soldiers up into the air with it. Then news came that Fuentes wasn't coming. He couldn't bring an army together. After a 2-month siege, the magistrates handed over Groningen to Count Maurits. The city was not plundered, and the people were pretty much left alone. The stadtholder embarked on a victory tour, visiting several cities to celebrate the annexation of the 7th state to the Republic. The Count got a 28,000 florins bonus and a new tent. Woo! Count Willem Lodewijk, the stadtholder of Friesland, now also became the state stadtholder of Groningen to keep the Frisians happy. Now Groningen could not lord over Friesland and vice versa. He also became the stadtholder for Drenthe. Meanwhile, the Spanish mutiny intensified. The men had made their base in Sichem, and every unhappy, starving, unpaid royal soldier was welcome there. They plundered the area all the way to the walls of Brussels, and even started negotiating with Count Maurits. They weren't switching sides, but they asked for his protection against Ernst. In return, they wouldn't act on the king's orders against him. The Archduke blew a gasket when he heard this, and sent Don Luis de Velasco y Velasco Marques de Belvedere Conde de Salazar with troops to Sichem. It took Velasco 3 attempts to drive the mutineers from the fort and lost a lot of men doing it. In December, Count Maurits granted the fleeing soldiers protection near Breda until they got what they wanted from Ernst, but made sure they didn't announce their oath to King Felipe. Ernst now negotiated with the soldiers and they made terms. They were given a daily wage and would not fight until they got their back pay in full. It would take another 13 months. That's all she wrote for this year. There was no more money, and the states had to keep their promise to King Henri to help stop the Spanish invasion from Artois and Hainaut. The moment the States troops arrived, King Henri IV of France officially declared war on Spain in January 1595. The winter was harsh. Rivers and streams froze over, leaving the Republic wide open for an attack. Count Maurits ordered farmers to break the ice of the Waal River and feared the worst. Nothing happened, but in May, when everything finally thawed out, it caused severe flooding. Governor-General Ernst had gotten no help from King Felipe. There was no peace and no cities were reclaimed under his leadership. He never married Isabella and was unable to murder Maurits. He went the way of oh so many royal governor-generals before him. He got ill, suffering from persistent bleeding, and died on February 20th, 1595, aged 42. Next in line for the governor-generalship was the 64-year-old Count Fuentes. He wasn't really, but he had old instructions written in Felipe's own hand, naming him Mansfeld's replacement if he died. Mansfeld wasn't dead yet, but his name on the form had been left blank. So Fuentes penned in Ernst's name and took over. The moment he did, though, Felipe gave him a chunk of cash and ordered him to march on France. There he took city after city. King Henri was quite upset that the rebels, but the English in particular, left him on his own to deal with Fuentes' victory lap around France. Queen Elizabeth even withdrew her men, claiming she needed them to deal with the Tyrone's rebellion in Ireland. The States protested that they had sent troops and supplies into Brittany already, but they still sent Philip of Nassau back to France with 3,000 foot and 500 horse to assist the king. This move in turn pissed Elizabeth off. If the rebels had that many troops left over and that much money available to fund campaigns in France, why was she still paying and supplying English troops for the Netherlands? Man, what a mess. Everyone wanted Count Maurits to get married. There was one problem. He didn't. Like any nobleman, he needed to secure his lineage and have heirs, and a good wedding deal would bring benefits to both the Republic and the House of Nassau. The States General had offered him various high-ranking women, but the Count wasn't interested. He became quite a ladies' man later in life, more about that in part 3, but as the French minister Villeroy observed, he won't be easy to marry, for his mind is not inclined to such oppression. But Maurits did everything he could to marry his sisters off to the highest ranks. He improved the standing of his house by a lot. When Prince Willem of Orange died, Maurits's many sisters had not been attractive brides to any people of their own rank and standing, and I don't mean that in a physical sense. Their father had died a poor man, and his titles were tied up with Philips Willem, who was still imprisoned in Spain. But because of his many victories, Maurits's reputation and the reputation of the House of Nassau rose to incredible heights among the foreign nobility. As a result, all his younger half-sisters were married off to high-ranking men. All except for the deaf Charlotte Flandrina, who had been raised by her Roman Catholic family, while her mother, Charlotte de Bourbon, was still alive. She converted to Roman Catholicism and joined a convent. Maria, Maurits's eldest half-sister, had settled in at the castle of Buren, her late mother's place. On February 2nd, 1595, at age 39, she married a man that Maurits wouldn't have wished on his worst enemies, least of all his sister, Count Philip von Hohenlohe-Neuenstein. Hohenlohe had gotten her father's permission to marry her back in 82, but Maurits had objected for a long time. Maria had another bone to pick with Maurits. Their father's inheritance had caused some problems. Philips Willem had been unable to take care of anything since his imprisonment in Spain, and Maria believed that as his full sister and eldest child in the family, she should take care of all his possessions. Count Maurits believed that as the head of that family, he should be in charge. Backed by Hohenlohe, Maria took her brother to court over this, but Maurits won. In 1595, he officially became responsible for all his father's properties and goods. Maurits's eldest sister Anna had died back in 87, but there was still Emilia, Maurits's younger full sister and housewife to the eternal bachelor. The 26-year-old Emilia wanted to marry, but she believed that if it were up to Maurits, he would never find her a husband. Soon, the proud daughter of Anna of Saxony was going to take matters into her own hands. The people in the Republic had gotten used to Count Maurits's success stories. They wanted more. With Fuentes away in France, Oldenbarneveld urged Maurits to move on Grol. The stadholders didn't know how. They had few resources, fewer men, and even less money to pull it off. Maurits wasn't able to head out until July 1595, when Count Philip and his men returned again from France. He went to Grol, dug for 7 days, fired 3 salvos as always, and demanded the surrender of the city. The governor of the place, Jan van Stierum, swore that he would hold Grol for God and king till the last drop of his blood. Count Maurits didn't have the money to start a dig like at Coevorden and Geertruidenberg. When good old Colonel Cristobal de Mondragón Talra de Mercado, the governor of Antwerp, heard about the siege, he gathered as many men as he could and marched to relieve the city. Mondragón was 92 years old now. Respect. But he really wanted the honor of fighting the young general before he died. Maurits was in a terrible tactical position, and when he found out that Mondragón was on his way, he ordered a head count of his army. He discovered there were 1,000 soldiers less in service than were on paper, so he raised a siege, despite protests from his officers and, of course, Hohenlohe, who never agreed with Maurits on anything. Felipe even thought that because Hohenlohe and Maurits really didn't get along, Hohenlohe could be bought and the king could get a few towns in the deal, so an offer was made. As far as we know, nothing came of it. Maurits fell back to Borculo and started rigorously sweeping the area, looking for the bandits who, posing as soldiers, terrorized the area. He brutally murdered them all, so the citizens could sleep safe and sound again. But the campaign wasn't over yet. Maurits also wanted to face Mondragón, his father's old foe. In August, Maurits set up camp at Bislich across the Rhine from Mondragón's camp at Xanten. The old colonel had received extra troops, including Count Frederik van den Berg and his men. Maurits carefully prepared an ambush and put his cousin Philip in charge of the lure. Philip had to grab Spanish soldiers foraging near the river and then retreat. Mondragón's troops would hopefully chase him into the trap that Maurits had laid behind some hills, with the rest of his cavalry, 5,000 foot, and some artillery pieces. On September 1st, Philip took 700 horse and headed out. In his party were his 2 younger brothers, the 21-year-old Ernst Casimir and 20-year-old Ludwig Günther von Nassau. The counts had been promised some time in the field by their older brother Willem Lodewijk. But Mondragón wasn't born yesterday. He had received intel about the state's plan and arranged a counter-ambush. He concealed his infantry and kept the cavalry on standby, while the foragers just did their thing as if none the wiser. Philip arrived the next day. Some saw the Spanish cavalry out of the corner of their eye, and their spidey sense told them to get the hell out. The ever-brave but very reckless Philip didn't want to hear it. He looked at the narrow pass that led to the field beyond and was like, let's lure all these suckers out. He put on his helmet, drew his sword, and dashed into the pass. The others followed single file but in great disorder. On the other side of the pass, the Spanish infantry waited for them in battle array. The rebels emerging from the passage one by one were easy targets for Mondragón's troops. The vanguard couldn't use their lances and defended themselves with pistols and swords as best they could. The rear guard tried to retreat, but they got in each other's way. It was utter chaos. Strangely enough, the rebels killed more Spanish than the Spanish killed rebels, but Count Philip had gone down early. He was shot from such close range that his clothes had caught on fire. Without water nearby, Philip had to roll on the ground over and over, wounded as he was, to put out the flames. Count Ernst von Solms, Eberhard's 26-year-old son, also got badly injured. Both men tried to get back on their horses, but fell to the ground, exhausted. They were taken prisoner. Count Ernst Casimir was also captured, but his younger brother Ludwig Günther saved himself by swimming across the river. Sir Francis Vere's brother Robert was also caught, but he was brutally murdered. Count Philip was taken to Rheinberg, where his wounds were dressed. He received a courteous visit from Mondragón and many other Spanish nobles who wanted to show respect to a member of such a famous house of warriors. According to Mondragón, the Count, biting away his pain, received everyone bravely as a true Nassau. Philip's cousin, Frederik van den Berg, came around as well, but to taunt him. What did he expect fighting for those beggars? Philip told him to just shut up. At midnight, Count Philip von Nassau died. He was 28 years old. Count Ernst of Solms died the next day. Both bodies were returned to Maurits with a heartfelt, mournful letter from Mondragón. Ernst Casimir was ransomed for 10,000 florins. Governor-General Fuentes was in the middle of the siege of Cambrai in France when he heard the news that a Nassau and a Solms had died. He was beside himself with joy. The Spanish camp burst out into celebrations, firing their cannons and weapons. It freaked the besieged out. What was happening? A few weeks later, on September 22, 1595, Francisco Verdugo, who was in Luxembourg preparing to lead forces into France, suddenly passed away. He was about 57 years old. He had just recovered from a bad spell of dysentery, but people thought he was poisoned, naturally. Mondragon and Maurits lay across from each other for a few more weeks, but winter was coming. The colonel sent a trumpeter asking the captain general to be considerate of his old age and grant him the military honor of breaking up camp last. In return, he promised he wouldn't pursue the count's retreating army. Maurits said no. Harsh. The old colonel broke up camp, and the captain general made a half-hearted attempt to chase him. Willem Lodewijk, still grieving for his brother, managed to steal a few wagons from the impedimenta. Maurits broke up camp a few days after Mondragon left and went to winter quarters. He did send out Francis Vere to take Nijenborgh Castle at Weert. It belonged to the late Count of Hoorn. The castle, basically a ruin, had a garrison of 26 men led by Captain Pruis. Pruis refused to surrender Nijenborgh, and Maurits ordered Vere to set up the cannons and start firing. The moment the cannonballs flew through the air, the garrison panicked and quickly surrendered. They asked to be allowed to leave with full honors of war. But Vere was like, "Are you joking? You defended this hovel and waited for the artillery to start firing before you surrendered? For shame, sirs, for shame." Vere had the men draw from 26 black and white straws. 12 men who drew black were hanged immediately. The 13th man who had drawn a black straw was their executioner. Commander Pruis was hanged first, but his rope broke, and the English soldiers had to hold him under water until he drowned. 3 months later, on January 3, 1596, in Antwerp, Mondragon sat down for dinner, and he passed away, age 92. Isn't that a bit of a sad end for such an incredible war veteran? The 30-year-old Infanta Isabella really had to get married now. The King of Spain turned his attention to Anne's younger brother, the 36-year-old Archduke Albrecht VII of Austria. Like Ernst, he had been raised at the Spanish court and had been like a son to the king. Albrecht had been the Viceroy of Portugal and had been good at his job. He was currently in Madrid to teach the Infanta Felipe, the king's only surviving son, all about the art of government. But Albrecht was a cardinal and had to resign his very lucrative position if he wanted to get married. Count Fuentes was fired and recalled to Spain, and the Archduke became Felipe's new governor-general in the Netherlands. Meanwhile, at the castle of Arevalo in Spain, the 7 keys to Philips Willem of Nassau's prison door turned, and the warden, Captain Barrionuevo, entered the chamber. He told the 40-year-old to come with him. Philips Willem feared the worst as he climbed into a carriage waiting for him in the courtyard. He was going to be executed now, wasn't he? He ended up in a house in the village of Escorial with a sweet couple who had him bathed, his hair cut, and his beard trimmed in the latest Spanish fashion. They also gave him a flashy new wardrobe. He was expected at King Felipe's court the next day. Philips Willem was still worried sick as he attended a banquet held in his honor at Escorial Palace. Then he got an audience with the king. Felipe received him with a wonderful demonstration of loving kindness and very gentle embraces. He told Philips Willem that he was a free man. After nearly 30 years in Spain, he'd returned to the Netherlands with the Archduke Albrecht. His job was to unite the 17 states again. On his way over, the Count of Buren visited the Pope in Rome. In January 1596, Albrecht and Philips Willem entered Brussels in a triumphal procession. The state sent the Count of Buren a letter wishing him lots of luck with his newly begotten freedom, but to not even try to enter the Republic. With love, the States General. Philips Willem's appearance in the Republic would knock Count Maurits' rank down a peg or 5, and they couldn't have that. FYI, everyone in the rebel Netherlands called him the Count of Buren to mock him. Felipe had called him that because he didn't want to speak the Nassau name, and he hadn't been crowned the Prince of Orange yet. Philips Willem was offered his inheritance, all his father's possessions in the Spanish Netherlands and France, but he refused to accept it. It came with a condition. He had to pay a yearly sum to the heirs of Balthazar Gerard, his father's assassin. No man of honor could accept this. And if the guards hadn't held him back, he would have killed Albrecht on the spot when he told him about these conditions. As a result, Philips Willem had very limited means to support himself. Count Maurits sent him quite a bit of cash from the money he had collected from their late father's estates on his behalf to help him out. Philips Willem asked to meet his half-brother a few times, but Maurits always refused. Was the fearless stadtholder scared of him? Or was he just being smart? The Count of Buren did get the States General's permission to meet his sister Maria in enclave on neutral territory. While in the room with each other for the first time in nearly 30 years, they were so choked up that they were barely able to speak for a long time. Albrecht, the king's new governor-general for the Netherlands, had to prove himself a worthy future husband for Isabella. The Archduke could no longer count on 4 major players of the Spanish army. Verdugo and Mondragon had passed away, Fuentes had been recalled and sent to Italy, and old Mansfeld wasn't worth much because his son Karl had died the year before in Hungary at the siege of Esztergom in the Long Turkish War. Albrecht had money, over 1 million florins, but King Felipe ordered him to go to France first. So in April 1596, the Archduke laid siege on Calais, an important harbor town close to the Spanish Netherlands and right across from England. When the Dutch guard ships patrolling the French coast realized what was happening, they warned Count Maurits. A large chunk of the stadholder's army was already in France, and a good number of soldiers were needed for his garrisons. He was left with about 5,000 men. Yet Maurits raced to Zeeland and sent more troops to France. He would go over there himself with more men the moment he could. However, the English only wanted to send help if they got Calais as a cautionary town. King Henri was livid. What kind of a friend was Queen Elizabeth if she just wanted to profit from his misery? He liked Maurits a lot better. He hadn't hesitated to come to the rescue. He alone was worth 4,000 men. The same day Maurits arrived, Calais surrendered to the Spanish, and the castle fell a week later after a storm by Belasco. The loss was painful for France, but also for the States. Their merchants already had their hands full with the Spanish pirates sailing from Dunkirk without having to deal with the ones sailing from Calais. Albrecht annexed the harbor town to Flanders and could now threaten his 3 enemies at once: France, England, and the Netherlands. But the price had been very high, not only in soldiers and supplies, but also money. Count Philips Willem had witnessed the siege. One day, a cannonball took off the heads of 2 Spanish soldiers standing near him, splattering him with blood and brains. He was told to retire, but he refused. He was in Nassau, from a courageous house. Meanwhile, Queen Elizabeth had prepared to invade Spain with an Anglo-Dutch armada. The combined fleets of England and the States, totaling 57 warships and 50 transport vessels, was assembled in Plymouth. It would be commanded by Admiral Charles Howard and Robert Devereux, the Earl of Essex. Since Sir Francis Drake, John Hawkins, and Roger Williams had all passed away, Sir Walter Raleigh, soldier, sailor, scholar, poet, and explorer, was brought on to help organize the chaos. Sir Francis Vere and Ludwig Gunther von Nassau also came along. On June 30th, 1596, the Anglo-Dutch armada arrived at Cadiz. They found a large Spanish fleet in the harbor, 4 large galleons, about 30 warships, and 57 East Indiamen. They had some 3,000 cannons between them. This massive firepower should have given the raiders pause. It didn't. They were like, "More loot!" They captured a few ships, burned some, and ran others aground, but most of the Indiamen escaped through a narrow passage that the rebels thought was impassable. The remaining ships couldn't prevent the invaders from landing. Essex and Ludwig Gunther took 1,300 men and drove 1,100 Spaniards back into the town and into the bastion. Then the young Nassau stormed that place, sword in hand, carried it at first assault, and planted his colors on the battlement. It was Prince Willem of Orange's flag. The Spanish garrison panicked and surrendered. Both sides had lost about 25 men each. 36 hours after its arrival, the small army had conquered a third of the Spanish fleet, the port of Cadiz, and its fortress. Most civilians were left alone, no one was murdered, and no one laid a finger on the women. But in their hurry to get into town, they had not taken formal possessions of the ships they'd captured. When they demanded 2 million ducats for ransom, Admiral Medina Sidonia refused to pay and ordered the ships to be set on fire. 32 vessels sank to the bottom of the harbor with all their equipment and 1,200 cannons. Essex and Vere wanted to hold on to the city and make it a base for English operations, but the other English commanders disagreed. It went against Elizabeth's orders. So, Essex ordered the town to be burnt down, and everyone left in August. But the victory wasn't exactly all that. They hadn't held Cadiz, and their spoils mostly belonged to Dutch merchants from Amsterdam and Middelburg. Oops. King Felipe was furious at the audacity of it all, but he was glad they hadn't attacked Lisbon because on October 5th, 1596, the King of Spain and Portugal mounted a second armada to invade England from that town. He had 128 ships, 14,000 foot and 3,000 horse. The fleet would land in Ireland, and Felipe hoped he could get King James of Scotland involved. Didn't he want to avenge the death of his mother, Queen Mary Stuart? But the fleet had barely left the harbor, or a big storm destroyed it. Felipe now told Albrecht to invade England instead, but the man had no fleet. It's Parma all over again. After taking and securing Calais, Archduke Albrecht's troops returned to the Spanish Netherlands. Maurits had to add more forces to all the border town garrisons. He now had fewer than 2,000 men to campaign with. The Count was mostly worried about Breda and moved on Bergen-op-Zoom, but the Spanish vanguard crossed the Scheldt and made camp before Hulst instead. Maurits sent as much support as he could. He really didn't want to give up Hulst, one of his earliest victories. When he asked Eberhard von Solms how many companies he needed and he answered 10, the Count sent 12. He also sent him more guns than had ever been used to defend the town. On August 16, 1596, Albrecht formally demanded the city's surrender and was surprised to find that the garrison was ready to give up. Solms's men just weren't in the mood to fight. They knew Maurits couldn't come to relieve them, and England wouldn't send anyone either. Zeeland fired Solms, but Maurits and the States General kept him on. The man had made a big mistake, but he was a good commander. Besides, they'd risk the wrath of Germany if they dismissed him. Meanwhile, Solms said that the Zeelanders should have fortified Hulst when they had the chance. But, as they say in Zeeland, ons windzinnig. They were too cheap. The States feared for Axel and Biervliet, but the Spanish army was tuckered out, and the Archduke begged Felipe for more troops. But the king sent nothing. He was still in shock that year, for the first time ever, the rebels had invaded his country, destroyed his ships under the protection of his bastions, and planted the damn flag of the Prince of Orange on his fort. The horror. King Henri of France had officially declared war on Spain. Queen Elizabeth of England was in the middle of it, although she had recently realized she'd never actually formally declared war on Spain. And then there was the Republic, not officially a country, and the man who had formally declared war on Spain, Willem of Orange, had been dead for a while now. But they were all fighting the same man, King Felipe. Maybe they should get together and hammer out some kind of treaty of mutual assistance. Elizabeth didn't really want to, but with Calais in Spanish hands, she had no choice. On May 7, 1596, French and English negotiators met at Greenwich and drew up articles for an offensive and defensive alliance. They promised to defend each other, attack together, and never make peace with Felipe without the other party's consent. They invited the Republic to participate. They had to match Elizabeth's commitments, but the English queen had tricked the rebels. She made a secret final agreement in which England's promises in the treaty pretty much all went out the window. But King Henri had forced Elizabeth to recognize the rebel Netherlands as an equal. In the Treaty of Greenwich, the Republic was acknowledged as an entity abroad for the first time. Then King Felipe cancelled all his debts to everyone and anyone, the third bankruptcy. He took back all the property that he had lended against money, and that was that. His decision ruined thousands of people across Europe, but the king felt he was justified. His holy war had turned him into a beggar, while his money lenders had grown rich. Don't come at me, it's God's will. The Spanish were in the field early in 1597. Archduke Albrecht had gathered an army of 5,000 near Turnhout under commander Philibert de Rey, Comte de Varax. He was the brother of the King Stadtholder for Gelderland, Mark de Rey, Marquess de Varambon. The army was too small to be a serious threat, but it was too big to just let them be. Marcellus Bax, who was in charge of the Breda garrison, talked to Count Maurits about this excellent opportunity. But the Stadtholder said he had to think about it. Everyone say it with me now. Maurits hated field battles. But the Council of State signed off on the campaign. And by the way, Excellency, keep your butt out of the firing line this time, please. On January 22, 1597, in deepest secret, the Stadtholder brought together 5,000 foot and 800 horse at Geertruidenberg with commanders Zwier, Solms, Hohenlohe, Bax, and Charles de Héraugière, the turf ship hero. They moved out before dawn the following day. It was a dismal, drizzly, foggy morning which turned to rain as the march progressed. Thaw had set in, and the roads were now covered with water, making the 12-mile trek difficult. The state's army arrived at Tielen that night, an hour's march away from Turnhout. Varax only now found out they were here. The scouts warned Maurits that he was practically within shooting range of the Spanish camp across the river. He was in a bad strategic position. If the Spanish infantry charged at them, they would easily destroy the Count's men who were tired from a full day's march. The Captain General pulled an all-nighter, inspecting the troops and perfecting the arrangements for the next day. He told Bux to take his cavalry, keep watch on the bridge that separated them from the Tercios, and hold it against any and all trying to get across. These guys were now so close to the Spanish camp that they could hear them talking. But Varax made no move. In fact, he was paralyzed with indecision. Should he stay put and strengthen his position to deflect an attack, or get the hell out of Dodge and avoid battle altogether? At long last, he chose the latter. The next morning, January 24th, 1597, rebel scouts discovered that Varax had disappeared. There were just a few musketeers guarding some planks the army had used to cross the creek to get to the Tielse Heath. The whole thing reeked of an ambush. Count Maurits ordered Veer and Bux to take a few men and check it out. When they approached, the Spanish musketeers ran away without firing a single shot. The two commanders crossed the creek just in time to see the Spanish rearguard entering the woods. Varax was in full retreat. Had the commander left a few minutes earlier, the Spanish would have been on a protected narrow road in the swamps and been safe from any attacks, but he was still in the middle of crossing the heath. As the Count watched the best of the Spanish army disappearing, he had to make a decision: let them go or attack them. The rebel foot soldiers hadn't caught up with the cavalry yet. They were 2 miles behind him. As the Spanish marched toward the narrow road, some became aware of something moving fast through the trees to their left. It was Hohenlohe and his cavalry. Maurits had ordered him to ride as fast as their horses could carry them to go around the heath and, under the cover of the tangled woodland, intercept the Spanish vanguard. The stadtholder didn't wait for the foot soldiers to catch up and got Veer, Solms and Bux ready to attack the rearguard. Count Maurits would stand to the side, obeying the States General's orders for once, with 2 reserve cavalry squadrons. Varax realized what was happening and quickly ordered the cavalry to move in between the tree line and the infantry. But then, Hohenlohe emerged on the heath ahead of the vanguard and spooked the Spanish cavalry. They raced off toward the narrow road and got away through the marshes. Varax got his infantry into battle array fast. He made 4 big blocks with pikemen in the middle, flanked by musketeers. At 8 a.m., the rebel trumpets sounded the charge, and Hohenlohe, Veer, Solms, and Bux all attacked. Except for some of Veer's musketeers, it was basically all cavalry, and the effect was surreal. When the Spanish musketeers saw the horsemen charging, they fired too soon and couldn't reload in time before the horses were on them. The musketeers fell back into the tightly packed group of pikemen who were driven apart, and the entire battle array collapsed fast. The Dutch cuirassiers and English cavalry shot their pistols and carbines at point-blank range and got right in between the Spanish troops. It was an absolute massacre. As the church bells at Turnhout struck 9, more than 2,000 dead lay on the heath, among them many officers and Varax himself, who had gone down early in the assault. 800 men were wounded and 500 were taken prisoner. Count Maurits had lost 9 men. But then a group of States cavalry who had started plundering the Spanish baggage train charged back onto the heath in a panic. They had 40 Spanish lancers on their heels. They brushed right by Maurits, who had stood off to the side directing and watching the battle, but he was almost alone in the field. The stadtholder's reserves had mistakenly charged into battle earlier. Maurits threw himself in front of the fleeing group to try to stop them in their tracks and get them into battle array. But there was no time. Just as the Captain General was about to be overtaken by the Spanish, Bux and a half-dozen heavy troopers charged to the rescue. So much for staying out of the firing line. Maurits remained in the field for 2 more hours and then headed to Turnhout to demand its surrender. The garrison of 60 men surrendered immediately. Maurits allowed them to leave unharmed. He said that there had been too much bloodshed that day already. Count Maurits returned Varax's body to Albrecht and told him that he had heard that the Archduke had ordered his army not to give quarter to any rebel soldiers. What the hell was that about? Maurits demanded to know why. The Count didn't get an answer, and he swore to hang the 500 prisoners of war if he didn't get the ransom money in 20 days. Maurits was mad. The money was paid, and the soldiers were released. Of the 39 Spanish banners, 38 were captured, though one was lost. These banners were displayed in the large hall at the Binnenhof in The Hague. Later that year, King Sigismund of Poland and Sweden sent an envoy to the States General and the Stadtholder. He really wanted the Spanish and rebel troops to help stop the Ottoman invasion. The envoy went on and on about the greatness and awesomeness of the merciful Spanish king, how they should stop fighting him and accept him as their sovereign again. They were too weak to fight the Spanish, because admit it, they really were. Maurits took the man by the arm and walked him into the large hall. He looked up at the banners. You were saying? After this victory, the country erupted in celebrations, and the defeat of the Spanish at Turnhout inspired poet and composer Adrian Valerius to write the hymn We Gather Together, which is today associated with the American feast of Thanksgiving. Archduke Albrecht was upset at his embarrassing loss but besieged Amiens in France instead. Count Maurits had had a plan for an attack on Venlo for about a year and a half now. He would repeat his trick that had surprised Breda and Trojan Horse to place. This time, they would use a coal ship instead of a turf ship. One of the skippers had the key to the water gate, and the idea was to smuggle in soldiers, take the gate, so that the rest could storm the city and conquer it. But because of the rain, the men's weapons failed, while citizens came out in full force to defend the gate, and then reinforcements arrived. About 10 men died during the failed trick, including turf ship coffer Matthijs Held. When the stadtholder saw that the venture had failed, he moved on. In France, Amiens fell into Spanish hands. King Henri now had to besiege that town to prevent an all-out Spanish invasion. Archduke Albrecht hesitated. Should he relieve Amiens and give Maurits free rein in the Dutch border towns, or give up the city and pounce on Maurits? He opted for the relief. The Netherlands didn't send Henri any more support because, well, they were just happy the Spanish were busy elsewhere. Count Maurits headed for Arnhem with Willem Lodewijk, Hohenlohe, and for the first time ever, his little half-brother, Count Frederik Hendrik of Nassau. The 13-year-old was considered old enough to endure the discomforts of war. Lieutenant Frederik Hendrik was put in charge of a cavalry squadron. He loved the army camp and adored his big brother. Maurits quickly took the town and castle of Alpen in Germany and then showed off his siege-laying skills to his brother at Rheinberg. Willem Lodewijk got shot in the leg again, and while Maurits had a quick lie down on his couch in his tent, a cannonball shot through the tent and flew right over his head if he had been sitting up. Rheinberg surrendered 10 days later. Frederik Hendrik wrote enthusiastically to his sisters that he had been instrumental in its surrender. This was in jest. It would be for realsies later. Spoilers. Next, Maurits laid siege on Moers, started shooting, and the town surrendered 3 days later. The commander Andres de Miranda asked Maurits if he could take his only cannon, an old 50-pounder, with him. The count laughed and gave him permission, begging him not to blow up any cities with his big gun. Next, Maurits crossed the Rhine River and came to Grol. 17 days later, the town surrendered. Next, Maurits had a section of his army move on Goor. The Spanish soldiers had already left, so that was easy. Next, Bredevoort had resisted too long, and after an 8-day siege was taken by storm. The place burned down by accident, leaving only 20 homes standing. Maurits was unhappy about this, but the other towns on his wish list were forewarned. Next, the city of Enschede. The commander there asked permission to examine the artillery. After a close inspection, they decided that resistance was futile and they were assimilated. Next, Oud-Marsum. Next, Oldenzaal. Next, Lingen. That town held out for 14 days before it too surrendered. Everything north of the big rivers was completely in states' hands. The Garden of the Republic of the Seven Netherlands was fenced in without enclaves. But in refusing to send help to King Henri, the states lost the French ally. After the king retook Amiens, he openly negotiated for peace with Spain and Rome. Let's go back to the surrender of Bredevoort for a sec. Maurits's sister Emilia worried that if it were up to her brother, she would never get married. She wasn't about to become a spinster either, so she took matters into her own hands. You go, girl. A young Portuguese prince, Dom Emanuel, had arrived in the Netherlands, asking the States General to help with his claim to take back the Portuguese throne from Felipe. Count Maurits had sympathy for his troubles, but there was nothing he could do. Emanuel, a Roman Catholic, couldn't join his army, and the prince couldn't convert either, because then he would lose his claim on the Portuguese throne. Don Emanuel spent a lot of time at Maurits's court in The Hague, where he met Emilia. He was charming, passionate, and very good-looking. Emilia fell in love, and Don Emanuel dug her as well. The couple started hanging out in secret. But Emilia couldn't get married without negotiations and the approval of the States General and Maurits. Her brother, clueless as he appeared to be about women and their needs, told her not to get carried away with such foolishness. Emanuel was a foreigner, a Roman Catholic, poor, with no way to earn money and no prospects, not a match for his sister, a princess from a powerful family. But Emilia felt that one day the Don might be somebody. Don Emanuel considered his honor at stake now and asked Maurits for Emilia's hand outright. The Count told him to show his birth records to prove he was legitimate. He was pretty sure Emanuel couldn't. The stadtholder left on campaign thinking he had handled the matter. But Emilia was Anna of Saxony's true daughter, afraid of nothing and no one, and set out to get her brother to sign off on the marriage. She entered the chaos of Bredevoort right after the siege. At the castle, Maurits and Willem Lodewijk were busy dealing with the dispute between their commanders. Everyone was drunk and there was a lot of screaming, swearing, and cursing. When Emilia's arrival was announced, Maurits shouted, "That's all we need!" Emilia had never seen her brother in this riled-up post-victory state and started to cry. Willem Lodewijk calmed Maurits down and they all talked. Emilia showed her brother a letter from Don Emanuel vowing that he was indeed a prince. Maurits said, "That's not evidence," and sent Emilia home again. An army camp was no place for a young noble lady. Emilia defied her brother and quickly married Emanuel in a Roman Catholic service at her home before Maurits returned, and she converted, so her children would be recognized as his heirs. The States General were shocked and told Emanuel to leave town before Maurits returned. When the Count arrived in The Hague 10 days later, he refused to see Emilia and stayed at his stepmother, Louise de Coligny's house. He then banished his sister to the Prinsenhof in Delft. There she went on a hunger strike, refusing to eat until she was reunited with her husband. Maurits thought it was just a fad, but it was a bad look for him and the States General. They sent a medical professor from Leiden University to her who specialized in treating women in her condition. He convinced her to start eating again. But when the States General sent Emanuel out of the country to Wesel, Germany, Emilia was furious. "I am a free daughter past my youth and I submit to no one." She didn't fear Maurits's wrath, the tyrant. After the Count sent her someone to tell her that he would no longer recognize her as his sister if she went, she went. And Maurits, livid that she hadn't obeyed his orders, cut her off financially. Now Emilia and Emanuel were united again, but they had difficulty getting by. They ended up making their home in Delft. They had 10 children, 2 boys, 8 girls. The story isn't over, but that's for part 3. The French government felt that the 2 other members of the Triple Alliance had dropped the ball and that King Henri was free to make peace with Spain. Johan of Oldenbarneveld raced to France to try to talk Henri out of it. While he was waiting for the right weather to sail, the French concluded their peace talks with Spain on April 5, 1598. Oldenbarneveld met with the king 2.5 weeks later. Henri promised to repay the Republic's loan for his war and would not prevent French soldiers to continue to fight for the rebel states. The king kept his promise. Had he not done that, the war would have been over. Oldenbarneveld also scored some major trade deals. The king was particularly impressed with Oldenbarneveld's 15-year-old diplomatic sidekick wunderkind, Hugo de Groot. When Henri saw him, he supposedly shouted, "Voilà le miracle d'Hollande! See here, the miracle of Holland!" More about Hugo in part 3. Later, in a private meeting with the king, Oldenbarnevelt warned Henri that even if France and England both made peace with Spain, the rebels would continue the war until they all dropped dead. He would leave it up to France and England to consider what the Republic's return to Spain would mean for their respective countries. King Henri wondered out loud, wasn't it time for the Low Countries to have a prince? A monarchy was stronger than a republic in the current climate. Why not make Count Maurits their king? He had the full support from the King of France and the Queen of England. It was like a gun went off right in Oldenbarnevelt's face. We don't know what happened next. Some say he said, "over my dead body," while he himself claimed that he had promised to talk to the States General about it. On May 2nd, 1598, Henri and Philippe signed the Peace of Vervins. Philippe formally recognized Henri as King of France and withdrew his forces from the French territory and handed back all captured towns. The Duke of Mayenne had also made peace with Henri, and the Roman Catholic League was officially dead. Now Oldenbarnevelt went to England to talk to them about their wish for peace. It turned out that Queen Elizabeth's threat to end the war with Spain was an empty one. She just wanted to rip up the Treaty of Nonsuch to get her money back and end her war obligations to the rebels. Oldenbarnevelt and the envoys adjusted the treaty relieving England from all obligations and agreed on a payment plan for a single sum of 800,000 florins. The rebels also had to pay the English garrisons in the cautionary towns. Once the debt was paid in full, these towns would be returned to them. And the rebels had to support England with ships and troops if they needed them. It was a high price to pay, but the Republic was finally free from the bonds of England. Oldenbarnevelt wasn't too worried if they failed to keep the terms. The Republic had become so rich, so populated, and with such a large naval force that neither France nor England would ever want the country to fall into Spanish hands. Ever. Meanwhile, in Spain, King Felipe wasn't doing well. The gout was so bad in his hands and feet that the mere touch of linen was painful to him. He feared his days were numbered, and a few days after the peace with France was concluded, he announced the engagement of Isabella and Albrecht. A few months later, he sent the letters to Brussels, officially transferring the sovereignty of the entire Netherlands, all 17 states, to his daughter Isabella and her new fiancé Albrecht. But the secession wasn't total and complete. Isabella and Albrecht still depended on Spain for financial and military support, and still had to obey Felipe's rules and orders. Albrecht was basically still Felipe's governor-general, not the new lord of the Netherlands. Still, the couple sent a peace proposal to the northern Netherlands. They listed two important conditions. The states had to submit to the Spanish Empire and allow the Roman Catholic faith room to exist. They would allow them to remain Protestant and leave the military and local governments intact. Count Maurits would be appointed stadtholder of the northern Netherlands, or, if he wanted, he could get a high position in the imperial army. The Republicans thought this offer was hilarious and never answered. They had discovered the secret clauses of the agreement. The Spanish troops would remain in the Netherlands permanently, and if the couple remained childless, the whole country would revert back to the Spanish crown the moment either of them died. If the country united because of them, Felipe had won the war. Then, to top it all off, just a few weeks later, another attempt on Maurits' life was uncovered. Jesuit priests persuaded the dead-ridden Pieter Panne from Leiden to walk up to Maurits as he was entering or leaving the French church and stab him with a poisoned dagger and a weather hook. But the stadtholder didn't show up for service that day. Panne was arrested, and he revealed everything. In June 1598, Albrecht and Isabella got married by proxy in Italy, by Pope Clement VIII himself. The Archduke wasn't there, but King Felipe was. However, his health was failing and he couldn't stand up. By mid-July, Felipe ran a high fever and he became weak and bedridden. The doctors opened abscesses on his chest and joints, but instead of bringing relief, now swarms of bugs feasted on the king's blood and flesh. The putrid smells coming from the wounds were a terrible torture for a man who had always been so neat and tidy. King Felipe was being eaten alive, and on August 1st, 1598, he was told his condition was fatal. His general confession lasted 3 days. The king believed he had never done any wrong his entire life. Any bad thing he'd done unknowingly, or because he'd been misled. Felipe ordered his servants to put a golden crown on a human skull placed on a sideboard in his chamber. On September 1st, 1598, he asked for the sacrament of extreme unction, a sacrament given to the sick and dying. He prepared his funeral, his procession, and gave gifts to his children who came to his bed one last time. He said, "Having governed my kingdom for 40 years, I now give it back in the 71st year of my life to God Almighty, to whom it belongs, recommending my soul into his blessed hands, that his divine majesty may do what he pleases therewith." At 5 o'clock in the morning, on Sunday, September 13th, 1598, Felipe, the King of Spain and Portugal, died, aged 71. With his death, the oath that the Dutch had taken to the king was officially broken. No one was under any obligation to obey the new King of Spain, Portugal, etc., 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 Felipe III. The Republic of the United States of the Seven Netherlands was more or less on their own now, and the full force of the Spanish army was about to come down on them. King Felipe II had spent $700 million on the war with the Netherlands and left his empire in ruins. But before his death, the king had given his daughter and her husband Albrecht a lot of money, and they used it to build a massive army. In October, Archduke Albrecht put Don Francisco López Hurtado de Mendoza y Mendoza Almeral de Aragon in charge of the royal forces in the Netherlands. Mendoza led 23,000 foot and 2,500 horse. Count Maurits had a third of that. It was strange, though. The man had brought no cannons. Was the admiral gonna tear down city walls with his bare hands? His men called him El Capitán de Rosario, Captain Rosary. But the Dutch rebels soon gave him another nickname, the Beast.